Hi, welcome back to the workshop. My brother's birthday's coming up and I'm going to be making him a presentation case for a bottle of whiskey. So rather than using a cardboard tube, this should look a bit nicer. Obviously when he's seen this video, it's after his birthday, because if I put this out first, he'll know what he's getting. So the inspiration for this project is the whiskey barrel. So the choice of wood has to be oak. Like in a barrel, I'm going to use staves to make a cylinder. So I start off by ripping some stock down to 17mm or a fraction over 5/8 of an inch if you're imperial. I'm going to need 10 staves, but I cut a couple of extra just in case I make a mistake. Once I have enough staves, I tip the saw blade to 18 degrees and run everything through on both edges. With two opposing sides at 18 degrees, that makes a total of 36 degrees per stave. Times that by 10 and I get my 360 degrees to make my cylinder. Then it's over the chop saw to trim everything down to length, leaving a little extra to play with. Now for glue up. My plan is to turn a cylinder and then split it in two lengthways, top to bottom, and insert two discs to seal the ends. Similar to how a whiskey barrel is made. I'm going to temporarily join two edges with masking tape and CA glue, so I apply masking tape to both of these edges. This will allow me to split it later. The clamp across the bottom of the screen is holding the staves in place while I tape them together. Then I flip it over, give it one more good press to make sure my tape's all stuck down properly. And of course, now realising that I should have made those bits of tape a bit shorter and they wouldn't have got caught. It's so satisfying when everything fits snugly. Once I've got it all rolled up, I can then start gluing together. So I split it back open and I grab some Type On 2 and proceed to put that down inside 8 of the joints. Of course, the 2 joints you can clearly see with tape are going to get some CA glue in a bit. Once I've got the glue spread out, I can then put some CA glue, probably went a bit overboard here, but want to make sure I get a good joint, down inside of those masking tape joints. Then I can roll this up for the final time and get plenty of tape on it to hold it together. Tape should be plenty sufficient. I'm going to wrap this probably with quite a bit of tape just to make sure that nothing moves. And finally just wipe off any excess glue. Off camera, I've removed the tape and added 2 sacrificial blocks which will allow me to mount it on the lathe and turn it. At this point I start to get worried about my tape CA glue joints exploding and sending me to A&E. So I add a hose clamp, and then I get worried about the hose clamp, so I add duct tape to hold the clamp, and that should hold everything in place. Using a gouge, I start to round off the staves, working from one end, stopping near the tape. And when I realise this thing isn't going to explode, I remove the tape and clamp, and what do you know, the video doesn't end here and I'm still in one piece. Every so often I stop the lathe and using a ruler I check to make sure I'm actually making a cylinder. I turn my attention to the ends of the cylinder and turn a dovetailed spigot for my chuck to hold onto. Once everything's nice and tight in the lathe, I turn the lathe on to sand and some idiot forgot to adjust the tailstock. Using the lathe as a clamp, I glue the spigot back on, and when it's dry I remount it back into the chuck with the tailstock in place this time and decide to hand sand with a block of wood, finishing 240 grit. I'll do a final sand later. Now it's time to split this cylinder into lengthways, or how else will I get a bottle of whiskey in it? I use a parting tool to cut a groove, and while doing this paranoia starts to set in again about it flying off the lathe for a second time, so I decide to hand saw it. I carefully cut within the groove, make sure to keep my saw blade as central as possible. Just in case I drop it onto the lathe bed, I spread out a cloth to prevent any damage. I then grab the saw and make the final cuts. And it's free, undamaged. Out comes my steady to help my paranoia as I tidy up the saw marks. The cylinder is round on the outside, but of course needs to be round on the inside as well. So I start to take off the internal facets. It's a bit dark in there, so I rig up a spot lamp to give a bit of extra life with a nice warm glow. The top and the bottom of the cylinder will need to fit together, so I cut an internal shoulder on the top and I'll cut an external shoulder on the bottom later. And of course, more sanding. I need to remove the sacrificial block now, so I flip the top round, and as I don't have a chuck big enough, I'm going to have to rely on internal pressure from my chuck. You may have noticed in the last couple of shots, the faithful hose clamps are back out, and this time it's really needed as the internal pressure is starting to open the CA glue joints. I bring the tailstock back in, and then with complete overkill, I add the steady back, as I'm going to cut the sacrificial block off without the saw this time. And there she goes. Half expecting disaster, I step back, but all is good. I now have a tube. Here's a wonderful shot of my elbow out of focus. It's supposed to show me working on the other end. And with the top done, it's onto the bottom, which is now sporting 2 hose clamps. And the steady is really being used properly now. The first thing is to cut the external shoulder. A quick test fit. I don't want to rush and have to make the bottom shorter. I need to remove some more, so I'm just creeping up on the correct diameter. And now I have a very snug fit, but once sanded, that should be fine. Back in with the parting tool now to remove the sacrificial block again. I did saw the last bit but forgot to press record. So now I have a long tube rounded at one end and faceted at the other. To turn the longer internal tube, I've ground the edge of a gouge, and some time ago I made this long handled tool out of an old windsurfing boom. With a bit of effort I can remove the tool and swap handles. This allows me to work deeper into the piece while resisting the pressures with the longer handle. The bit of blue tape you see on the gouge is to how far I need to go. And more sanding, and then a bit more sanding to make the tube smooth. I'm going to use a router bit with interchangeable bearings to create a rebate to fit the top and bottom, similar to how a whiskey barrel top and bottom are fitted. I suppose I could have turned this on the lathe, but it's far easier and quicker with the router. So with excitement, I remove the hose clamp and the strip of leather protecting the wood from the metal, and a drum roll please as I split the cylinder in half, peel off the CA glue. The bottom gets the same treatment, and I do try to tidy up as I go. Off with the hose clamps and the leather, and the bottom half comes apart with ease. All I have to do now is peel off the CA glue and tape. To seal up the ends of the cylinder, I pre-glued some oak together, and then I cut them into discs. I used some masking tape and CA glue to create a temperature joint again between these two surfaces. I hold it in place, and once dry, I remove the extra masking tape, which in my case is rather a lot. And then this is mounted on the lathe and turned around. I then need to thin down the edge to fit into the rebate I cut earlier with the router. Like the lid of the barrel, I'm having the centre thicker than the edges, so I'm creating a hollow. A test fit shows I'm close but not quite there yet. The joint doesn't quite close up down the side of the cylinder, so a bit more fine tuning is required to get the fit nicely. The hollow will actually be on the outside, but of course on the lathe I have to work this way round. And another test fit shows everything closes up nicely. I'm sure you're bored of it, but a bit more sanding. It's time to start assembly of the wooden cylinder. The edges where the tape and CA glue were are given a sand to make sure they're nice and tight joint. And then I apply some glue down the length and brush it out. Next, I put a little glue in the rebate, but only on opposing edges. I'm not gluing it all the way around. This will allow the lid to expand and contract should it need to, however I'm not expecting much movement. Tape is applied to hold everything in place while it dries, and then the bottom is given the same treatment. I put the cylinder back on the lathe and give it a final sand to smooth down the transition between the top and bottom. With the main tube completed, apart from applying wax finish, I need to make a label holder now. So I cut a block of oak with the same radius of the tube. I decided that my accuracy in metal folding might not be good enough, so I'm doing all the folding first and then cutting. I hand bend a thin sheet of brass roughly to match the radius of the block. It's not going to be perfect, but close enough. I clamp the bent brass between the blocks of wood in my vise. Wow, my vise is loose, so I need to fix that. Leaving a few mil of the brass plate sticking up, I use a hammer, beat the protruding metal down, trying to get it as flat as possible. This is the bottom of the label holder, and it also gives rigidity to the brass. Next, I use a triangular file to mark where the edge bends are going to go. This is going to fold back towards the cylinder, creating a void for the card. I then refine these marks by using square file. To give a nice crisp fold, I use a piece of angle iron in my loose vise, and again hammer to beat the fold into place. It's a nice crisp corner and I'm really happy with it. Okay, I've marked up to make 2 tabs that allow me to screw the label holder to the cylinder. Using a Dremel, I cut out the metal on each corner and then put it back in the vise to bend it. No hammer this time, just brute force to manually put it into place. Next I can cut the excess metal off and then file it level with the back of the label holder. I also give the radius a good file too, using the oak block to help me hold it. Now onto the side tabs. There are going to be 4 screws fixing the label holder to the wood. This time I use the fret saw to cut everything out and then give it a good file back to my arc lines. This is repeated on the other side. I really think this is starting to look good. The screw holes are drilled out, and yes, I probably should have clamped this. I then drill holes so I can cut the centre out to show the label, because it would be completely useless as a label holder if you couldn't see what was on the label. As I've measured from the folds, everything is nice and accurate. And I use a combination of my Dremel and my saw to cut out the centre. Then finish off with the sanding drum in the corners. Just look at the concentration there as he works. A final file to knock off any burrs, and that's going to be ready for finishing. To mount the label holder to the cylinder, I pre-drill some holes. The last thing I need now is the cylinder to split. The tape on the drill bit helps me judge the depth. The brass screws I want are slightly too long, so I trim the ends off with some pliers. The shortened screws can now be used to fix the label holder in place without protruding into the bottle inside. At this point, you may notice that the label holder is polished. I later hit this with some satin lacquer. To keep the cylinder shut and stop its precious cargo from spilling out onto the floor, I'm going to use some leather disc and cords. Run with me on this one, it will become clearer when you see it working. I need 4 of these discs, a pair for each side. I cut these out and then punch a hole in the centre. I then burnish the edges on my pillar drill with a little beeswax on the sides. The main cylinder gets 3 coats of wax. I got a little carried away with the lid, but it all got rubbed in eventually. And then a good buffing with a soft cloth. On the unwaxed base, I stamp my maker's mark and then seal with some satin lacquer. For the leather discs, oops, I almost messed up drilling that hole. I draw the same depth as I used on the label holder, and then a length of cord is wrapped around the shortened screw and a leather disc with a brass washer is screwed in place. Note how the label holder is now in a satin finish. The last piece of the puzzle is the label. I bought an 8-year-old bottle of Lagavulin, and after setting the bottle aside I flatten out the box and select the main logo for the label. There are actually quite a few portions of the box that could have been used. There is a section with describing the whisky, or a section with a small logo on, or I could have even handwritten the logo. And with the label in place, I put the whiskey bottle in the cylinder, use the cord, wrap it around the leather discs, first on one side, then on the other. And now for the final shot of the oak whiskey bottle holder. I hope you like it, and happy birthday, big brother.